Welcome to video 5 in our Theoretical Framework series, Mechanisms and Relationships of Constructs. In my previous videos on ambiguous constructs, I focused on the importance of well-defined constructs. Today we turn to the next step, connecting those constructs. In this video, we'll learn how constructs relate, the different kinds of relationship we can theorize, and why they relate, the underlying mechanisms or processes that explain those links. By the end of this video, you should be able to distinguish different relationship types, causal, correlational, conditional, reciprocal, and articulate the theoretical mechanisms, for example, mediators, pathways, and processes that give those relationships explanatory power. We'll also examine common pitfalls, such as circular reasoning, jingle-jangle fallacies, and pseudo mechanisms that only give an illusion of explanation. In theory building, a mechanism refers to the process or pathway by which one construct influences another. Think of a mechanism as an engine inside a theoretical model. It is the chain of events or entities that generate an outcome. Mechanisms are tangible elements that explain how something happens. For example, a mechanism can be defined as entities and activities organized such that they are productive of regular changes from start or setup to termination conditions. In simpler terms, a mechanism is the causal story that unfolds between a cause and an effect. In the context of social and organizational science, a mechanism can be considered as one of the processes in a concrete system that makes it what it is. A proper explanation consists in unveiling some lawful mechanisms behind observed patterns. If we observe that organizations with high trust also have high performance, a mechanistic explanation would identify what happens inside those organizations to produce that outcome. For example, trust may lead to open communication, which improves coordination and thus boosts performance. The open communication would be the mechanism linking trust to performance. It's important to distinguish mechanisms from mere associations. A mechanism is not a vague placeholder or an abstract label. It is a specific process with definable components. In leadership research, for example, we theorize that leader humility improves team innovation. A black box hypothesis may simply state humble leaders cause a team to be more innovative, but a mechanistic theory would investigate deeper how leader humility translates into team innovation. We propose that humble leaders encourage psychological safety among team members, which in turn frees people to share creative ideas, which leads to higher team innovation. Psychological safety is a mediating mechanism. It is the process link explaining why leader humility, which is the input, results in team innovation, which is the output. To avoid confusion, theoretical mechanisms often correspond to what researchers call mediators in quantitative research. A mediator is a variable that transmits the effect of an independent variable to a dependent variable. In our example, psychological safety mediates the relationship between leader humility and innovation by carrying the effect forward. Mechanisms are not about external conditions or background factors. Mechanisms answer the question, what is happening between X and Y that makes X lead to Y? Importantly, mechanisms provide the why behind a relationship. A complete theory specifies what factors are involved, how they are related, and why, which is the rationale or mechanism justifies those relationships. The what gives us constructs. The how gives us a framework of connections. but the why, which is the mechanism, gave us explanatory power. A theory without a why may show a correlation or even causal pattern, but it remains a black box. We see inputs and outputs, but not the inner workings. Such a theory is less satisfying and often less useful for practice because we don't know how to intervene effectively if we don't understand the process. A theoretical mechanism is the explanatory process that connects constructs in a theory. It often corresponds to a mediator in empirical research, but more generally, it can be any generative pathways, for example, sequence of events, interactions, or entities that produce the outcome of interest. Next, we turn to the types of relationships that can exist between constructs because identifying a mechanism requires understanding the nature of the relationship you are explaining. Not all relationships between constructs are created equal. Here we distinguish between several fundamental types of relationships: causal, correlational, conditional, and reciprocal. A causal relationship means one construct directly changes another. Here, X is viewed as an independent variable or cause, and Y as an dependent variable, which is the effect. Here is a simple example. Leadership training increases employee engagement. If this is a causal claim, it means implementing leadership training, which is X, will produce higher employee engagement, which is Y. Causal claims imply a direction of relationship and ideally a mechanism. An independent variable is a predictive variable that causes a change in the dependent variable. Establishing causality is powerful but very challenging. It requires ruling out other explanations and often demonstrating the sequence. X precedes Y and the mechanism. Theories in applied fields often strive for causal relationships because they inform interventions. If we do X, we can achieve Y. If theory tells us that employee autonomy causes higher job satisfaction, an organization can act on that by increasing employee autonomy. Causal arrows are the backbone of explanatory theory, but they must be backed by logic and empirical evidence of why causation flows that way. A correlational relationship means that two constructs change together, but we're not asserting a direct cause-effect flow, or we are unsure of the direction. For example, school size is associated with student achievement. Perhaps researchers find that smaller schools tend to have higher test scores. That is a correlation. However, correlation alone does not establish which is cause and which is effect, or whether some third factor, like socioeconomic status of the community, explain both. Correlational relationships are common in explanatory research where controlled experiments are very difficult, like leadership research. They are valuable for prediction. If we know X, we can anticipate Y to some degree, but without theorized causality or mechanism, they offer less explanation. Often, a correlational finding is a starting point. We then ask, why do those go together? For our example, we may theorize a mechanism. Maybe smaller schools nurture closer teacher-student relationship, which is the mechanism, which improves student achievement. Here, we turn an observed correlation into a causal story. Correlation is not causation. A big part of theoretical framework is moving from mere correlations to identifying underlying factors or processes. A conditional relationship means that the effect of one construct depends on a third construct. This is typically the role of a moderator variable. A moderator changes the strength or direction of a relationship. For example, the impact of workload on employee stress depends on social support. Here, social support is a moderator. If support is high, a heavy workload may not lead to as much stress. But if support is low, the same workload may cause much more stress. In the causal diagram, a moderator is often illustrated as an arrow pointing to another arrow, showing it influences the relationship between X and Y. Conceptually, conditional relationships specify when and for whom a certain effect will hold. This adds boundary conditions to theory. Many theories in leadership and management include moderators, often call it depends factors. Because human systems are complex. For example, a leadership style may be effective in one context but not another. Identifying moderators helps make a theory more precise and by clarifying the contingencies. A reciprocal relationship means that two constructs influence each other in a two-way loop. This is called reciprocal causation or feedback loop. Here is an example. Employee satisfaction and organizational performance have a reciprocal relationship. Satisfied employees, which is X, tend to boost performance, which is Y, through higher productivity and commitment. At the same time, a well-performing organization, which is Y, tends to make employees more satisfied, perhaps due to better resources, confidence, or rewards. Therefore, X causes Y, and Y causes X in an ongoing cycle. Reciprocal relationships are common in social systems. Think of how a leader's behavior and team morale continuously shape each other. Handling reciprocity can be tricky because our usual statistical models assume unidirectional causality, but conceptually it's important to recognize when feedback loops are at play. Often, a reciprocal theory can be broken down into sequential causal steps. X at time 1 influences Y at time 2, which in turn influences X at time 3, and etc. Including reciprocal links in theory acknowledges the dynamic, evolving nature of many phenomena. For example, mutual influence between variables over time. Understanding 4 types of relationships helps you map out the structure of your theoretical framework. Are you proposing a straightforward cause-effect chain? Is it a web of interdependence? Are there tipping points or contexts that change the game? Once you know the type of relationships, you can be clearer about the kind of mechanism that may be involved. A one-way process, a two-way feedback process, or a context-dependent process. I also need to talk about temporal sequence. Some relationships may be static correlations, while others unfold over time. A causal mechanism often implies a sequence. First, X changes something, then later Y changes. Reciprocal ones imply iterative sequences. As researchers, we need to make it clear if the relationship we propose are synchronous or if there is a time element. Many process theories explicitly describe stages of time. Now, when discussing relationships among constructs, we should introduce 2 other key terms that often arise: moderators and confounders. We already touched on moderators. They create conditional relationships. A moderator is a variable that changes the strength of the link between X and Y. It does not explain the link. That is the mediator's job. Consider the hypothesis: inspirational leadership increases team performance, but only when the team has high skill. Team skill is a moderator here. It conditions the effect of leadership. With low skill, inspirational pep talks may not translate to results. With high skill, they do. Moderators are important in applied research because they help explain boundary conditions, when a theory works or does not. A confounder, on the other hand, is not a part of your theoretical model, but an external variable that misleads you into thinking a relationship exists when it really does not, or obscures the true relationship. A confounding variable is essentially an extraneous variable that is related to both X and Y and thus gives a false impression of a direct link. For example, we find a positive correlation between the number of firefighters at the scene, which is X, and the amount of damage from fire, which is Y. One could naively theorize having more firefighters causes more damage, which is a spurious causal inference. The confounder here is the fire size. Big fires cause more damage and require more firefighters. Fire size confounds the relationship. In social science, classic confounders include things like socioeconomic status, time, or common method bias that may cause two variables to move together. Although confounders are more a concern for research design than theory, a good researcher is aware of them. We want to ensure the relationships we propose are not better explained by some unaccounted factor. Often identifying a confounder can actually lead to new theoretical insight. Perhaps it's not X causing Y at all, but Z causing both. In your research, when you interpret relationships, always ask, could something else be behind this association? The key takeaway, mechanisms and construct relationships go hand in hand. When you propose a relationship in theory, clarify its type. Is it causal, correlational, conditional, or reciprocal? And then ask what mechanism would produce that relationship. If you propose a certain mechanism, ensure it fits the type of relationship you claim exists. This brings us to why all this matters. Mechanisms and carefully specified relationships greatly enhance the explanatory power and credibility of a theory. Why do journal reviewers, dissertation chairs, and seasoned scholars emphasize not just relationships, but also mechanisms? Because identifying a mechanism transforms a theoretical claim from what correlates with what to what causes what and how. This substantially increases the explanatory power of your theory. Explanation in science is about opening the black box of a phenomenon and showing the inner workings. Consider an example from organizational science. Researchers long observed that organizations with a strong organizational culture tend to perform better. That's a correlation. But it's not very explanatory to simply say culture is correlated with performance. Two different organizations could both have strong cultures, but of entirely different types. One organization has an innovative culture. Another organization has a very strong customer service culture. So what about culture is driving performance? To explain, a theory may specify a mechanism. Shared culture leads to aligned employee behaviors, which is mechanism, which in turn improve performance metrics. Now we have a story. Culture works because it coordinates behavior towards common goal. The construct aligned behaviors act as a mediator, making the ambiguous construct of culture concrete and actionable. Here's another example. Frederick Taylor in the early 1900s proposed that there was one best way to do any job, which was the theory of scientific management. Early evidence showed that applying Taylor's principles, for example, timing tasks, standardizing tools, often boosted productivity, which is a correlation between Taylorist practices and output. But Taylor went further to articulate mechanisms. For example, breaking work into small standardized motions reduced worker fatigue, which is the mechanism, and improved efficiency, or performance-based pay give workers an incentive, which is the mechanism to produce more. Whether or not one agrees with Taylor's approach, it was influential because it explained why those practices should work. Less wasted motion, motivated workers, rather than just claiming X increases output. The explanatory mechanism made the theory persuasive and testable because one could measure fatigue or motivation to see if those actually changed. Theoretical contribution lies not in identifying factors alone, but in showing how they relate and why. Merely adding a new construct to a list is not theory. Relationships, not lists, are the domains of theory. More importantly, it is the logic behind those relationships that gives the theory its power. When you provide a clear mechanism, you allow others to evaluate the plausibility of your logic. Does it make sense that X would lead to Y that way? And to test it empirically, you measure M to see if indeed X influences M and M influences Y. With a mechanism specified, even a failure is instructive. Maybe X did not influence M as we thought, or M didn't influence Y. It tells us where the theory broke down. A theory with a clear mechanism is more falsifiable, and that's a good thing. A theory that does not expose its mechanism can be so ambiguous that it escapes being proven wrong or right. Popper critiqued certain pseudo-scientific theories on exactly those grounds. They use ambiguous constructs or circular logic that destroy the testability of the theory, which makes it impossible to refute. For example, imagine a theory that claims organization X succeeded because of synergy. If we ask what synergy means and how it operated, and the answer is essentially synergy means the organization succeeded by working very well. That's a tautology, explaining success by saying they succeeded because they succeeded together. This type of pseudo-mechanism is unfalsifiable and uninformative. We could never find evidence to contradict it because any outcome can be labeled or not enough synergy after the fact. Good theory avoids such magical or circular explanations. Specifying mechanisms also guards against the fallacy of confusing correlation for causation. When we articulate how X could cause Y, we inherently think about the time sequence and direction. Doing so helps ensure we don't leap to causal claims without basis. It also forces us to consider alternative explanations. If we hypothesize a mechanism and it's wrong, testing can show that we thought empowerment could increase performance via morale boost, but actually morale did not improve. Maybe our theory is wrong or incomplete. This is healthy for scientific progress. By contrast, if we had just said empowerment increases performance, and it failed, we may shrug or be tempted to tweak definition post hoc to salvage the idea, which is a slippery slope into unfalsifiability. Mechanisms keep us intellectually honest and concrete. Explanatory power matters for applied fields like ours, leadership and administration and organizational science, because the practitioners and decision makers often ask, why should A lead to B? Will it work in my context? What exactly should I do to get outcome B? A theory that only says A is associated with B gives them little to act on. But a theory that says A influences B by doing X and Y along the way provides a lot of levers. If you know the mechanisms, you could intervene at intermediate points. For example, if our theory says employee engagement improves team performance through employee displaying proactive helping behavior, and the administrator can focus on encouraging those helping behaviors as an actionable step. If we only knew engagement correlates with team performance, the administrator may be at a loss or may try random actions to engage employees, not knowing what exactly to look for. Clarifying mechanisms and relationships transforms a theory from a descriptive account to an explanatory framework. It satisfies the scientific urge to understand, not just describe. A deep explanation answers, how does it work? What makes it tick? That is exactly what we aim for by theorizing mechanisms. In doing so, however, we must be cautious of several common pitfalls. Even seasoned researchers can stumble when building theoretical linkages. Here we'll discuss a few prevalent issues tautology, jingle-jangle fallacies, pseudo mechanisms, and problems arising from ambiguous and overlapping constructs. Being aware of those issues will help you critique existing literature and refine your own work. Tautology, also known as circular reasoning, creeps into leadership literature whenever a construct is defined or explained in terms of itself. This type of definitions sound elegant, but upon inspection, it adds no analytical value. A defensible construct definition must avoid tautology. Circular reasoning is pervasive in leadership literature. Have you seen someone who defines leadership as the ability to lead others toward goals? Do you see the problem here? This is a typical example of circular reasoning. The definition relies on the very root it is supposed to illuminate. To define a construct, one normally identifies a broader category and then specifies distinguishing attributes that set the construct apart from neighboring phenomena. Here, the purported broader category is the ability, but the distinguishing attributes to lead merely restates the construct in its infinitive form. The sentence therefore translates to leadership is the ability to exercise leadership. This is the tautology that offers no new theoretical ground. It does not disclose how influence is exerted, which mechanisms convert intent into collective action, or why some goal-oriented efforts qualify as leadership while others do not. This definition simply substitutes a grammatical variation of the target term for an explanation. It avoids the analytic work of specifying causal pathways, boundary conditions, or necessary or sufficient features. In short, it leaves the phenomenon precisely where it began, linguistically repackaged, but theoretically unexplained. Early treatments of charismatic leadership describe it as leadership that relies on charisma, and ethical leadership is often presented as leadership that is ethical, definitions that merely loops the noun back to its adjective form. Another example of circular reasoning surfaces in some treatments of social justice leadership. Introductory descriptions routinely describe it as leadership that advances equity and justice. Difficulties arise when the discussion goes on to gloss equity as justice enacted in practice, while portraying justice as a commitment to equitable outcomes. In that configuration, it creates self-referential loop, a sealed discursive circle. Instead of occupying distinct logical roles, the two words simply mirror one another. Sound theoretical reasoning requires us to introduce independent causal apparatus capable of accounting for variation. For example, one may explain justice by appealing to the mechanisms of distributive, procedural, interactional, and informational fairness, each of which can be operationalized and tested. When equity is introduced to justice applied and justice to a commitment to achieve equity, however, no explanatory content is added, only definitional recursion. This circularity renders the theory analytically sterile. It lacks the capacity to generate meaningful distinctions, testable claims, or causal insights. Researchers are therefore left without usable levers, such as resource allocation formulas or accountability routines that could distinguish effective from ineffective social justice leadership practices. Theoretical clarity, therefore, demands us to supply novel generative mechanisms, whether power redistribution strategies or data-driven equity audits. When the two constructs collapse into a single unanalyzed value claim, the entire enterprise ceases to be theory and becomes tautology masquerading as insight. I need to point out here that not all scholarship on social justice leadership succumbs to this circular reasoning. Many studies have specified concrete practices and mechanisms that can be empirically interrogated. However, the circular reasoning persists in popular and some scholar discourse, and recognize its limitations remains a prerequisite for cumulative scientific progress. Breakout tautology demands introducing genuinely distinct explanatory elements. Instead of writing that a cohesive team succeeds because of cohesion, one may argue that team cohesion fosters dense communication networks which improve error detection and thereby enhancing performance. By inserting intermediary mechanisms, communication density, mutual monitoring, error detection, the definition no longer presumes its conclusion, but sketches causal pathway open to empirical challenge. Only when our theoretical language forces a risk of disconfirmation rather guarantees rhetorical safety do we escape the gravitational pull of circularity. The second issue is a jingle-jangle fallacy. I have discussed these two fallacies in detail in my last video on ambiguous constructs. If you need to refresh your memory, go back to watch that video. Next, let's talk about pseudo mechanisms and magic constructs. This issue occurs when a theorist offers something that sounds like a mechanism, but really is not. It's either a restatement of the outcome or an empty abstraction. In research, we sometimes see terms that offer the illusion of explanation but leave the black box sealed, claiming that A causes B due to organizational synergy may sound plausible, but unless synergy is defined in operational terms, that is translated into specific, observable, and measurable behaviors, processes, or structural features, it functions as a pseudo-mechanism. Operational definitions are essential for transforming abstract concepts into empirical propositions. They specify what to look for in the real world. If synergy is said to enhance performance, does that mean increased cross-functional collaboration, reduced redundancy, or improved knowledge integration? Without such translation into measurable indicators, we are left with empty placeholders that may impress rhetorically but explain nothing. The danger is that those magic constructs mask the absence of causal specificity and give theories an illusion of depth while shielding them from empirical scrutiny. Another sign of pseudo-mechanism is excessive reliance on metaphors or undefined constructs. Metaphors can inspire mechanisms, but should not replace them. If I say culture is the DNA of an organization, so it determines performance, I'm using a metaphor, which is DNA, without explaining the genes, proteins, and processes in this metaphor. The metaphor compares culture to DNA, something foundational and determinative, but it stops short of identifying how culture shapes behavior and performance. What are the specific norms, routines, and communication patterns that drive outcomes? Without translating the metaphor into observable and measurable processes, it remains a pseudo-mechanism, a rhetorical flourish that sounds explanatory but does not actually clarify causality. In the organizational literature, metaphors have been used intentionally as a heuristic tool, that is, as devices to help us see complex phenomena in new ways and generate theoretical ideas. Gareth Morgan's influential book, Images of Organization, is a foundational example. He proposed metaphors such as organization as a machine, brain, or political system, not as final explanations, but as lenses to prompt new lines of questioning. The value of a metaphor in this sense is that it opens up inquiry. It encourages researchers to consider what organizations would look like if they behaved like ecosystem with the metaphor metaphor of organism, information processors with the metaphor of brain, and conflict arenas with the metaphor of political systems. However, problems arise when researchers use metaphors as if they are mechanisms without further specification. If one argues, for example, that organizational learning occurs because the organization is like a brain and stops there, then the metaphor does not clarify the actual processes by which organizational learning occurs. For example, feedback loops, memory systems, and role specialization. In that case, the metaphor becomes a pseudo-mechanism, an illusion of explanation that substitutes analogy for analysis. Theoretical rigor requires that we eventually translate metaphors into concrete constructs, processes, and relationships that can be operationalized and tested. Otherwise, we risk mistaking evocative language for scientific explanation. Also be aware of what we call relabeling as explanation. Sometimes researchers take an outcome and give it a new name as if it were the cause. For example, suppose data shows that higher motivation leads to better job performance. A pseudoscientific mechanism would be to say this happens because the motivational force within individuals. Motivational force is defined and measured independently of motivation and performance. This is a circular, hidden tautology dressed as a mechanism. True mechanisms should be independently conceptualized and ideally observable in some way distinct from the cause and effect. When mechanisms are so ambiguously defined that any result can be claimed consistent, we have a problem. In robust theory, a mechanism should be defined clearly enough that you could in principle observe it, or at least detect its consequences. If you propose that X improves employee task performance through increased intrinsic motivation, which is a mechanism, you should be able to discuss what intrinsic motivation looks like, how we'd know if it increased, and someone could test that. If instead you said through better vibes without further detail, that's too nebulous. It becomes a pseudo-mechanism, more like a placeholder for something good happens than an actual explanation. One way to check yourself after writing a theoretical mechanism, ask, is this essentially a restatement of the outcome or cause, or is it introducing a new element? Also ask, could this mechanism be wrong? If so, how would we know? A mechanism that cannot possibly fail is probably not a real mechanism. Ambiguity, overlap, and misalignment of constructs tie closely to jingle-jangle fallacies. Generally speaking, if your constructs themselves are ambiguous, any relationships between them will be on a shaky foundation. I specifically discussed ambiguous constructs in my last video. Here I focus on misalignment of construct. It can occur when the constructs are ambiguous. Misalignment can also occur between theoretical and operational definitions. Perhaps theoretically, you define construct X one way, but the measure or examples you use in practice tap something else. This can lead to non-replicable relationships. For example, if you define organizational learning as a construct about knowledge processes, but then measure it by asking leader if their team is world-class, which may actually measure pride or arrogance, any finding related to organizational learning to outcomes could be questionable. Maybe it was not organizational learning at all, but the leader's overconfidence driving the results. The theoretical relationship gets contaminated by construct mismeasurement. Overlapping constructs, which means high theoretical redundancy, can lead to tautological relationships. It can also lead to construct proliferation, where we have many slight variations of a construct all interconnected, and the studies linking them don't really advance unique theory. If you find yourself citing many sibling constructs and linking them, consider consolidating or choosing one. The value of a theoretical relationship increases when the constructs are well differentiated and precise. If a construct is ambiguous, any mechanism that has the construct can be equally ambiguous. For example, leadership quality is an ambiguous umbrella term in the theory. A claim like leadership quality improves organizational outcome through better organizational culture raises a lot of questions. What aspects of leadership? What is better culture exactly? This ambiguity weakens the credibility of the claim because it's not clear what to test and how to falsify it. As a result, critics could rightfully say the theory is too mushy to be useful. As you refine your own theoretical models, keep those pitfalls in mind. Clarity and specificity are the antidotes. Each construct should be well-defined. Each linkage should have a rationale that does not collapse into circularity or semantic confusion. Scrutinize every because in your theory. Is it a real mechanism or just an appeal to a buzzword? Are your constructs distinct enough that linking them produces new knowledge, not tautology? Some may think my critique is overly critical. Please remember, identifying those weaknesses in existing literature is a chance to make your theoretical contribution much stronger and set your theoretical framework on solid ground. Next, I'll shift from critique to construction. How can you refine and identify mechanisms in your research and ensure your theoretical relationships are clear and credible? For researchers, developing a theoretical framework can be very challenging. Often, you are dealing with messy real-world issues and try to impose a theoretical structure. Here are some of the steps you can take to help you refine your mechanism and relationships in your dissertation or any research project. First, always ask why and keep asking it. When you propose that X influences Y, don't stop there. Immediately follow up by asking, why would X lead to Y? Your first answer may be because of Z. Then ask, how does Z connect to X to Y? This process of iterative questioning is known as the 5 whys technique, a method originally developed by Toyota for root cause analysis but powerfully applicable to theory development. The core idea is very simple. By asking why multiple times, typically 5 times, but not always, you investigate beneath surface-level explanations to uncover the underlying causal mechanisms. In theory building, the 5 whys helps move from ambiguous associations to detailed, testable pathways. For example, you hypothesize that a new coaching program, which is X, will improve employee performance, which is Y. But why? Perhaps because it increases knowledge, which is Z1, and motivation, which is Z2. But don't stop there. How does knowledge help performance? Maybe it enables employees to solve a problem faster, which is your mechanism 1. And how does motivation help? Perhaps it drives employees to put in extra effort, which is mechanism B. Now your theory becomes more precise. Coaching enhances knowledge and motivation. Knowledge speeds problem solving. Motivation increases effort, and then performance improves. This is much more informative than merely claiming coaching improves performance with an unspecified because. The goal here is not to question indefinitely, but to continue probing until the explanatory chain reaches a point that is clear and grounded in evidence or logic and potentially testable. That's when a hypothesis becomes a theory, not just a guess, but an explanation. Second, identify mediators and moderators explicitly. In building your theoretical framework, think in terms of mediator, which is a mechanism that explains how or why X influences Y, and moderators, which are boundary conditions under which the relationship between X and Y may vary. Those constructs are not exclusively to quantitative research. They are equally important in qualitative research that seeks to understand processes, context, and the variation in meaning and outcome. If your primary interest is in causal explanation, ask what may mediate this relationship, what may modify, enable, or constrain this effect. For each proposed mediator, explain why it logically or empirically links X to Y. For each moderator, clarify why the effect may differ across cases, settings, or identities. For example, consider a study on technology use, which is your X, and organizational learning, which is your Y. A potential mediator could be employee engagement. A technology increases greater involvement and attentiveness, which enhances organizational learning. A moderator may be organizational hierarchy. In rigid hierarchy, employee engagement may not translate into organizational learning because employees lack autonomy to apply what they have learned. Alternatively, in a qualitative study, you may find that sense-making practices mediate the relationship. Employees interpret new technology in ways that reshape the collective understanding and drive organizational learning. Prior technology experience may emerge as contextual moderators that shape how different groups experience and make sense of the same intervention. Explicitly laying out those mechanisms, you move beyond naming variables or themes. You begin to build a theoretical narrative that explains both the process and the conditions of the phenomenon. This signals to readers that your theoretical framework is not just descriptive, but analytically rigorous and sensitive to causality, complexity, and context. And third, be wary of confounds and alternative explanations. Put yourself in a skeptic's shoes and list what else could cause Y or explain the X to Y. If your theory is employee autonomy, which increases organizational innovation through enhanced intrinsic motivation, a skeptic may say, could it be that high-performing organizations tend to grant more autonomy and produce more innovation, so organizational performance is the real driver? That performance factor is a potential confound. Acknowledge those possibilities and, if possible, incorporate them into your theoretical framework as control variables or elements to empirically account for. Theoretically, you may argue why the mechanism still holds after controlling for performance. Perhaps both low and high-performing organizations experience innovation gains when autonomy increases intrinsic motivation. The key is don't present your mechanism in a vacuum and ignore well-established existing literature. Demonstrate that you've considered alternative explanations. This strengthens the credibility of your claims and help distinguish your proposed mechanism from a spurious correlation. 4. Refine constructs to avoid overlap. As I've discussed earlier, clearly define your constructs and distinguish your constructs from sibling constructs. If your theory uses two similar constructs, consider collapsing them or articulating a difference. If you have both job satisfaction and employee morale in your theoretical framework, you should ask, do I really need both? If yes, define how they are different. Perhaps satisfaction is about job task, but morale is about overall organization spirit. If you cannot articulate a difference, using both will confuse your mechanism. Does X improve satisfaction and morale via the same path or different ones? You may then choose one construct that best fits your needs. In your literature review, be on the lookout for synonymous terms or slight variations. This is where a lot of jingle fallacy lurk. Pin down which definition you are adopting and stick to it consistently. When your constructs are clearly defined, your mechanism will be likewise. You should fight the fog of jargon in the terminological jungle. Clarity is your friend. Number 5, avoid magic bullet mediators. It is tempting to insert something all-encompassing as mediator. Terms like culture, leadership, motivation, or innovation, because they appear to explain a great deal. But if those constructs are too broad or underspecified, relying on them amounts to conceptual hand-waving or worse, magical thinking. They give the illusion of explanation without actually identifying how or why change happens. Instead, effective theory building requires breaking down those umbrella constructs into specific testable components that do the explanatory work. For example, instead of claiming that organizational culture change will reduce employee turnover through employee burnout, a more theoretically sound formulation may specify that increased perceived awareness in workload distribution and supportive supervisory behaviors as facets of organizational change reduce emotional exhaustion, which in turn decreases employee turnover intentions. Those subconstructs such as perceived fairness, supervisory support, emotional exhaustion are concrete, measurable, and provide a clearer causal pathway. Large umbrella terms may sound scholarly, but the goal of theory is not to impress with abstraction. It is to clarify with precision. Broad mediators often trigger scrutiny from dissertation committees and journal peer reviewers who will ask, what do you mean by innovation, motivation, or leadership? And rightly so. Those umbrella terms encompass multiple dimensions, each of which could operate differently. Preempt those critiques by either defining the construct rigorously, or better yet, by defining more granular subconstructs such as idea generation, implementation climate, or autonomy support that illuminate the specific mechanism. This level of specificity not only strengthens your theoretical claims, but also increases the likelihood that your work will inform empirical research and practice. Number 6, link back to established theory for rationale. Very often, your proposed mechanism can be strengthened by anchoring it in established theories or prior empirical findings. This is how you situate your work in the accumulated knowledge of the field and demonstrating theoretical coherence. Suppose you propose that employee empowerment leads to creativity through psychological ownership. Rather than presenting psychological ownership as a novel insight standing on its own, you can enrich your claim by drawing on self-determination theory, which posits that autonomy is a fundamental psychological need that enhances intrinsic motivation and personal investment. Empirical studies have shown that when employees perceive higher levels of empowerment, they're more likely to feel a sense of ownership over their work, which in turn increases their willingness to take creative risks and generate novel solutions. When you situate your mechanism in an established theoretical tradition or link it to cumulative empirical evidence, you demonstrate that your theoretical framework is not an isolated speculation, but part of a broader scholarly discourse. This approach also enables you to clarify the logic of your mechanism, rather than relying on an abstract or latent construct like psychological ownership. You can specify the actual organizational activities and perceptions that give rise to psychological ownership. For example, shared decision-making, discretion in task execution, and recognition of contributions. Go beyond naming a mediator. Instead, describe the organizational processes, routines, and interactions that substantiate it. This is precisely why the literature review is often integrated into your theoretical framework section or chapter. Literature review is not merely a catalog of previous studies, but critical scaffolding of your theoretical argument. Reviewing existing theories and empirical findings relevant to your constructs and mechanisms help you clarify how your proposed relationships fit into, diverge from, or extend what is already known. It shows that you're not building your theoretical framework in a vacuum, but are instead weaving your ideas into the broader fabric of scholarly knowledge. This integrated approach to literature review enhances your credibility as a researcher and strengthens the explanatory power of your theoretical framework. Number 7, diagram your theoretical model. This may sound basic, but actually constructs as boxes, relationships between them as connectors, typically arrows, can expose hidden assumptions and missing elements in your theoretical framework. Visualizing your model helps ensure you include all essential components, clearly labeled constructs, which are your boxes, directional connections, usually are represented by arrows, and ideally annotations on those arrows to clarify the underlying mechanisms. This process of visualization prompts careful reflection on the nature of the relationships you are proposing. In many theoretical frameworks, one-headed arrows are used to denote hypothesized causal direction, that is, construct X theorized to influence construct Y. By contrast, lines without arrows or double-headed arrows are often used to indicate correlational or covariational relationships, where the two constructs are associated but no direction of influence is specified. With that said, it's important to recognize that visual elements alone do not establish causality. A diagram may suggest causal relationships through arrows, but causality must be supported by theoretical justification, empirical design, and where relevant, causal identification strategies. Confusing correlational links with causal ones or failing to specify the directionality altogether can signal theoretical imprecision and reduce the interpretability and credibility of your theoretical framework. Being intentional and transparent about how you use visual elements ensures that your theoretical framework communicates both structure and logic with clarity. For example, consider a theoretical framework that jumps directly from leadership style X to organizational performance using a single arrow. This implies a direct causal link, but it skips over the important question of how and why such an effect occurs. This is very common in many doctoral students' work. It glosses over a very important cross-level inference problem. How does an individual-level construct, such as a leader's behavioral pattern, which is the leadership style, directly influence an organizational level outcome like overall organizational performance? The causal pathway from micro-level behavior to macro-level outcomes typically operates through meso-level mechanisms that aggregate or diffuse individual influence. What are the intermediate processes that transmit or amplify leadership effects through the organization? For example, leadership may shape team cohesion, psychological safety, clarify role expectation, promote goal alignment in different work units. Those changes at the group or unit level can influence employee behavior, coordination, or innovation, which in turn contributes to organizational outcomes. Without articulating those mechanisms and without showing how effects scale from individual to the organizational level, your theoretical framework becomes not just incomplete, but theoretically incoherent. To build a sound theoretical framework, especially in multi-level contexts, which are common in leadership research, it's very important to specify mediators that link constructs across different levels of analysis at the individual, team, and organizational levels. Leadership is inherently multi-level. A leader's behavior, which is an individual level construct, may shape perceptions at the team level, influence group dynamics, and ultimately influence organizational outcomes. However, those effects do not operate in a linear or unidimensional fashion. They require theoretical justification for how influence travels across levels. For example, how individual level leader behavior aggregate to shape team-level climate, or how they trigger emergent phenomena like shared norms or collective efficacy. An emergent phenomenon refers to a property or pattern that arises from the interactions among individuals, but is not reducible to any single individual's characteristics. It is a qualitatively novel outcome that manifests at a higher level of analysis. For example, collective efficacy emerges from shared perceptions and mutual reinforcement of confidence in the group. Similarly, a team climate of psychological safety arises from repeated interpersonal exchanges, feedback dynamics, and mutual behavioral cues, not from any one person's disposition. Understanding emergency is important in leadership theory because it explains how individual level inputs, such as a leader's behavior of value viewpoint diversity, can give rise to higher order phenomena, such as a culture of voice and participation that have real consequences for team and organizational functioning. Ignoring those emergent properties can lead to theoretical models that leap across levels without explaining how collective level constructs form or exert influence. Explicitly theorizing the mechanisms of emergence help you move beyond simplistic leader-centric views toward richer system-aware frameworks that better reflect the complex realities of organizational life. Another key construct is especially relevant here: aggregation. Aggregation refers to how individual level effects combine to form a higher level construct. For example, multiple employees' perceptions of fairness forming a climate of procedural justice. Emergence, on the other hand, refers to qualitatively new properties that arise from interactions among lower level entities, such as organizational learning or culture, emerging from distributed team behaviors. Failing to account for those mechanisms result in what some scholars call a black box explanation, a presumed effect with no visible explanatory machinery. Clarifying how constructs operate and interact across levels strengthens both theoretical rigor and methodological validity. It also enables more sophisticated cross-level modeling, such as multi-level structural equation modeling and hierarchical linear modeling, which are powerful tools for testing how individual, team, and organizational level variables interact in nested systems. Those quantitative methods can help us uncover how variance is distributed across levels and how effects propagate upward or downward through an organization. Qualitative research also plays a critical role in cross-level theorizing, particularly in uncovering how and why emergent properties arise from micro-level interactions. Through methods such as comparative case studies, ethnography, and multi-perspective interviews, you can trace the interpretive processes, language, routines, and symbolic actions through which individual behaviors into shared meanings, group norms, or cultural patterns. For example, an in-depth case study of leadership in teams may uncover how a leader's framing of failure influences psychological safety, which then becomes embedded in team norms over time. Those insights are indispensable for theorizing emergence, understanding context-specific boundary conditions, and building grounded models of cross-level influence. Here is an example. If you study employee retention, and your theoretical framework jumps from leadership behavior, which is an individual level construct, straight to retention, which is an organizational level outcome. You are bypassing the motivational, psychological, and structural processes that likely mediate that relationship. This kind of leap shows a theoretical gap. To address it, you'll need to look at motivational theories like self-determination theory, job characteristic theory, or expectancy theory, which you will learn a lot in this semester. And you'll also look at empirical literature on retention to uncover the plausible mechanisms, such as increased job satisfaction, perceived support, or career growth opportunities that actually explain why leadership may influence retention. Sketching the theoretical model forces you to engage those theories and make those connections explicit. The diagram of your theoretical framework demonstrates the structure and the logic of your argument at a glance. It also helps you catch floating constructs with no clear purpose, arrows without justification, or theoretical leaps that bypass known explanatory processes. And number 8, iterate and get feedback. Theoretical thinking improves with iteration. Discuss your proposed mechanisms with your classmates and mentors. Often, an outside perspective will ask a seemingly simple question that shows a flaw, missing link, or plausible alternative that you had not considered. Someone may say, you claim mentoring leads to career success through confidence building. Could it also be skill acquisition? You didn't mention that. Perhaps both are valid mechanisms, or perhaps skill development was not even on your radar but should be. Feedback can surface those blind spots and prevent your theoretical framework from resting on unexamined assumptions. In our class meetings, I'll be constantly asking you to explain the mechanisms. Expect a lot of why and how questions. Why does X lead to Y? How does the mechanism actually work in practice? You will be expected to justify every box and line in your theoretical framework, not by intuition or anecdote, but by drawing on existing literature and established theories. Whether your theoretical framework is simple or complex, each construct and relationship must be backed up with a peer-reviewed scholarly literature. To help you prepare, use the dissertation buddy GPT assistant that I created. The link is provided in our Canvas course. It can help you brainstorm mechanisms, identify relevant literature, clarify construct definitions, and sort through possible mediators or moderators before class discussions. It is a low-stake, high-impact way to test your thinking and uncover gaps before presenting your ideas to others. And also take advantage of class presentations and discussions. Pay attention to where people look puzzled, unconvinced, ask clarifying questions. This is one of the best ways to test the clarity and plausibility of your theory. Confusion from others is not a failure. It's a signal that you need to refine your explanation or revisit the logic of your assumptions in your theoretical framework. The goal is not to defend a theoretical framework at all costs, but to refine it until it reflects a coherent, evidence-based account of a phenomenon you want to explain. To wrap up this video, building strong theoretical mechanism is an iterative, thoughtful process. It requires clarity of thought, knowledge of context, creative imagination to envision processes that may not be immediately visible. When done well, it greatly enhances the credibility and implications of your research. Your claims will stand on a clear logical structure, not just on empirical correlations. And when someone asks, but how does X lead to Y? You will have a compelling answer ready, one that can spark further discussion, inquiry, and application in the field of leadership.